Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. This is Lady Freedom coming at you with another raw narrative. Today is May 6th, 2024, and Sebastian Wayne Drake Rogers is still missing. He has been missing now for 71 days. Last night I was on a live that Duchess for the Missing had, and I wanted to pop in and just give you some takeaways that I learned last night. I also want to do a little story time about myself just so I can share with all of you a little bit about me. I have always loved listening to other people's stories, and when I thought about starting a YouTube channel to talk about other people's stories, I couldn't help but think it wasn't very fair of me to talk about other people's lives when I wasn't willing to talk about my own. I think anybody that has lived on the planet over 20 years has enough trauma or maybe even enough experiences and knowledge of the real world. And sometimes it's more than we ever want to know. Sometimes it's worse than we ever want to think, and sometimes humanity can be so damn awful. But on the flip side of that, it can also be the one thing that keeps us alive. Human connection is a basic fundamental need that every one of us has. As much as we need air, water, food, we need love, affection, and compassion. Last night, when I was thinking about the trajectory and what I was doing before I got distracted, was that I was combing over the first 7 days of mainstream media footage, and I was researching autistic teenagers, mainly boys, because I think there is a difference when it comes to gender, and especially at the age of 15, when you are going through life changes, it's definitely different for a female versus a male. And so in general, growing up is hard, and when your body is going through physiological and emotional changes, it's very difficult. And we all know that, especially if we're old enough, and everybody should be, because this video isn't for kids. I also wanted to highlight the parent's perspective. If you don't have a child who has special needs or autism, you may not understand or know what they're going through. And so I wanted to highlight that and to show what other parents were going through, and hopefully that would have been seen as well as a way to feel connected and understood. My deep thoughts about this case brought me back to my roots, back to Brene Brown. Years ago, when I was seeking help for my PTSD and the trauma that I experienced from narcissistic abuse and domestic violence, it brought me to a local organization that helps women get out of abusive relationships, and they also have counseling services. So I definitely took advantage of that once I realized what it was that I needed to heal. And so last night, when I was thinking, I started watching Brene. This is something that I really would love to share with Sebastian's parents, and I am talking about all three of his parents. Because last night on Duchess's Live, I sat with a great bunch of people, and it was something that I really needed in my connection with other people. It was funny because there was a t-shirt giveaway and there was a wheel, and we just couldn't get the numbers, and it was something that, as it was happening and even afterwards, I couldn't help but think to myself, I really hope that Seth, Chris, and Katie are watching this. And I know that Chris and Katie were, but I was really rooting for and hoping for them to be laughing and feeling a sense of community because I think that is really important in the situation that they are in, especially because there is no evidence out there that we know of that is solid that the police have come out with against the Proudfoots. And so I was really hoping that they were partaking in that joy, because no one deserves to be dragged through the mud, and nobody deserves to be kicked when they're down. I also observed something last night that it wouldn't be fair if I didn't share with all of you. Katie and Chris were working last night, and they were promoting the t-shirts that they have enlisted the help of a t-shirt company to help them make and distribute. So you can purchase a t-shirt for $22. It's a small, medium, or large t-shirt, and it has Sebastian's missing information on it. It's also kind of like a hunterish green color, and it's very beautiful. And if you're wanting a bigger size as well, you can do $1 more per XL size. So if you want an XL, it's $1 more, $23, $24 for a double XL, so on and so forth. And so when I was watching them work, and I was watching them trying to find their son, trying to get the word out, Duchess has been working blip billboards, which are digital billboards, and so she's been working with them on that, and I did not know that before. Another thing that I didn't know was that Katie and Duchess are closer than it appeared to me. I've been trying to go over the interviews to find out information about what's gone on with Sebastian, and I realized that I'm the type of person that when I am dealing with adversity and awkwardness and even trauma and traumatic situations, mainly just even a fear of someone or their actions or behaviors, I call it making my spidey senses tingle, or I could feel my spidey senses going off. Either way, there's a disturbance in the force, and I can feel that. And so I've learned to identify that. But I tend to act, like a clown. I'm a bit of an ass clown when it comes to being sarcastic and a little bit silly and joking around and wanting to make people laugh, because I've learned to take things not so seriously, but also it's a major defense mechanism for me. I remember a family member telling me one time that I reminded her of Chris Farley, and I said, okay, and she goes, because you can be very, very sad, and you're very sensitive and emotional. And she said that I really believe that you're hiding behind your jokes, basically, and that you're not as happy as you put yourself out to be. You're putting on a bit of a mask when you joke about things, and I can agree with that. I can say that is probably a fair assessment, that instead of crying about it, I'll make a joke about it, or I'll be very awkward and find a meme that fits or something like that. And it's just something that helps me get through it. And so I really hope it helps others get through it, but I don't want it to be taken out of context. Another thing that I learned from a good friend of mine is, and it was dealing with my ex-husband and the divorce and everything, and family court and everything. He would see how upset I was about the situation. I would get physically ill. Like, there were times where I was so bad into like the depression of the PTSD of the having to deal with it and the anxiety, and then going to court, and I would be physically ill over it. And he would tell me, he'd say, you cannot let your ex run your emotional throttle like that. You cannot let him run your emotional throttle. And I'm like, why do you always have to be right? and I'd always say that to him, and I wouldn't even, and sometimes I'd say it to him in a mad way, like, God, why do you always have to be right? I'm sick of asking you for advice, damn it. That's not what I wanted to hear. But, so some of the best friends we have and some of the best people out there for us are people that will hold us accountable. And so that's also a form of love, in my opinion. So what I'm getting at is I definitely let Chris Proudfoot run my emotional throttle with the video that I just put out, and it's dropping, I think, right now. And so I just wanted to come on, and I wanted to put a little bit more perspective into it, and I also wanted to get back on track with what I was previously doing before I was distracted, because what I put out there, to me, is it's very important for, and I spoke about the elephant in the room, I spoke about the double-edged sword in other videos. They're both as sharp on either side. When I look at a situation, I'm always going to go for Sebastian, because he's a 15-year-old kid, and I'm a mom myself, and I don't want to hurt Katie Proudfoot. I can see myself in Katie Proudfoot in a lot of different ways. And so I do take it personally, I suppose. I can see myself in situations with Seth a lot because of what I went through in my own divorce. And so when I take a look at that, it's hard for my emotional throttle not to be rocked at that point, but or pushed to the limit, but I still shouldn't let it cloud my judgment, because at the end of the day, I need to be using my better judgment to put out content that is caring, compassionate, and the reason why I wanted to start telling these stories in the first place. And so I want to share with you my journey of healing, and hopefully give out some good resources, and then also spread some awareness. And so when I get too far into being silly and sarcastic and putting up that comedy mask a little bit too much, I need to reel myself back in, and I also need to look at what's important. And so that's what I really wanted to share with everybody today, because that's what's really important to me, and I just want the truth to come to light. And so I'm going to continue to go over these interviews as scheduled. When I was on the trajectory of talking about the first 7 days, I was going to go back to Duchess's interviews and talk about the interviews with the Proudfoots. Duchess on the 3rd of March and on the 17th of March, and then we were going to get into Nancy Grace. So I'm trying to build out a timeline and a playlist that may be helpful. And in doing that, I wanted to give a little bit of the platform to the Proudfoots, because they deserve to be heard, and they also deserve to be in a good place. And what I learned, or what solidified my thinking last night, was being in that community and sharing in that love and that community of people that can sit all together, and we can have differences of opinions, we can have different thoughts, we can have different feelings, and we can also still come together as all being human beings, and all being important, and all of our views and perceptions are all important. And so I saw a completely different side of Chris and Katie last night, and I loved to see that side. And I will always stand up for what's right. I will always stand up against abuse, against bullying, against jerks, but I will also be willing to give that jerk a hug, because guess what? I'm no perfect person, and I've been a jerk too. More times than I can count, more times than I could probably make about, I could probably make a playlist on my own shenanigans, and it'd be hours and hours of footage. I could tease myself until the cows come home, so to speak. But what I was trying to do here was I was trying to take the only breadcrumbs that we have and assemble a whole cookie, if you will. And so I want to go back to that, but I also want to spread this message of love out there as well. This is for Seth, Katie, and Chris. Let's watch.
Weekend, a really good friend of mine who lives in New York called and said, "How are you feeling about the 99 conference?" And my answer was, "What do you think is the least invasive way to extract eyeball juice from a first grader?" And his response was, "Oh God, are you in that place?" And I said, "No, really, here's the idea. There is a total pink eye epidemic in my son's class, and if I could get some of the juice, I could give myself pink eye, which would be a legitimate excuse not to go. And I could even do a selfie with a big eye, and then it would be legit." And he said, "I thought you were excited." And I said, "I was excited, but as I was working on my keynote, I realized that I had kind of tricked myself into believing that this was my tribe. And then I realized my obsession with fonts doesn't really make me one of you." And he said, "Well, what was going on when you thought you were one of them?" And I said, "I don't know, I'm gonna have to think about it." And he said, "You're a researcher, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're not, a creative." And I said, "No, these are the creatives. These are the people that no one sat with in high school and then everybody wants to be when they grow up. I'm a researcher. No one sat with us in high school. No one still sits with us." So I thought about it, and I thought, okay, so I'm a researcher. I study connection. I study vulnerability. I study love. And then I realized why I thought you were my tribe. I think it's because design is a function of connection. There is nothing more vulnerable than creativity. And what is art if it's not love? So it made sense to me to be here. And then I thought, okay, 99% perspiration. They said, don't talk about inspirational stuff, talk about the how-tos. So, my name, sometimes I name my keynote presentations things that'll make me feel better about being here. So this one's called Sweaty Creatives. Because I know what it means to be a sweaty creative. Because I create all the time when I write, the way I translate my research, when I talk. And I know what the perspiration feels like. And so what I want to talk about today is the perspiration that no one talks about very often. And that's not the perspiration from the hard work and the laborious part of creating. It's the perspiration from fear, from the cold sweat, the stuff that pops up on our eyebrows when it's not supposed to be there because we're presenting an idea or talking about something that we care about. And then we're begging our body not to sweat. Like when they said, "We're filming you against black, could you wear something else?" I'm like, no. That 99% perspiration thing, I'm down with that. I got that. I'll be wearing, yes, my option will be navy. So I know about sweaty creatives. So I want to tell you about something that changed my life as a creative person. And it's a quote from Theodore Roosevelt, and it is completely, I know it sounds cheesy and cliche to think a quote can change your life, but sometimes when you hear something, when you need to hear it and you're ready to hear it, something shifts inside of you. And so my story is that I am a researcher, and I never thought I would have a big public career. And so I did a TED Talk that went very viral. And in the wake of that, I was kind of everywhere for a couple of months, on every CNN.com, NPR. It was everywhere, and something I wasn't used to. And the marching orders from my therapist and my husband were, do not read the comments online. So I read all the comments online. And so one morning, I woke up, and there were 2 or 3 new articles out, and I started reading the comments. And they were devastating. They weren't about my work, they were about me. They were super personal. And they were the things that creative people play in their mind and then give up doing what they really want to do. Like if I asked every single one of you, what would you try if you knew people would never say this about you? What would this be? Those were the comments that morning. Of course she embraces imperfection. What choice does she have? Look how she looks. I feel sorry for her kids. Less research, more Botox. Just mean personal attacks, the things that really, up until that moment, had inspired me to stay very small in my life and my career, just so I could avoid those things. So that morning, Steve and the kids leave. I stay home. I get on the couch, and I watch 8 hours of Downton Abbey. And when it's over, I don't want to turn off Downton Abbey. Because the minute you turn off Downton Abbey, then it's like soccer practice and dinner and back to the mean people, and maybe, should I get Botox? And maybe, maybe if I stand still when I talk. So I get out my laptop and I do a search for who was president in the United States during the Downton Abbey era. Have you ever done that? Like you're numbing with TV or a movie, and so when it's over, you just like stay in that space by like learning more about the actors and what's going on. I've been doing this long enough to know that this is like, you're laughing with me, not at me. So I put it in, and Theodore Roosevelt comes up, and a quote comes up. And I read it, and this is what it says. It's a quote from a speech that he gave in the early 1900s at the Sorbonne, and a lot of people call it the Man in the Arena speech. And this is the passage that changes my life. It's not the critic who counts. It's not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles or where the doer of deeds could have done it better. The credit belongs to the person who's actually in the arena, whose face is marred with blood and sweat and dust, who, at the best, in the end, knows the triumph of high achievement, and who, at worst, if he fails daring greatly. So the moment that I read that, I closed my laptop, and this is what shifted in me. 3 huge things. First, I spent the last 12 years studying vulnerability, and that quote was everything I know about vulnerability. It is not about winning, it's not about losing, it's about showing up and being seen. The second thing, this is who I want to be. I want to create. I want to make things that didn't exist before I touched them. I want to show up and be seen in my work and in my life. And if you're going to show up and be seen, there is only one guarantee, and that is you will get your ass kicked. That is the guarantee. That's the only certainty you have. If you're going to go in the arena and spend any time in there whatsoever, especially if you've committed to creating in your life, you will get your ass kicked. So you have to decide at that moment, I think for all of us, if courage is a value that we hold, this is a consequence. You can't avoid it. The third thing, which really set me free, and I think Steve, my husband, would argue has made me somewhat dangerous, is kind of a new philosophy about criticism, which is this. If you're not in the arena also getting your ass kicked, I'm not interested in your feedback. Period. That's it. If you have constructive information, feedback to give me, I want it. And I'm an academic. I'm hardwired for wrestling around with stuff like that. You say, hey, you forgot all this literature. Or, hey, you should have done this. Or terrible sentence construction over here. Like, let's do it. I love that. But if you're in the cheap seats, not putting yourself on the line, and just talking about how I could do it better, I'm in no way interested in your feedback. So I know about the sweaty creative. And so what I want to do today is I want to talk very specifically about the arena. This is where we sweat. How many of you know this feeling by just looking at the picture? Yeah, show of hands. How many of you know this feeling? So this is what we do down here. Like, I don't know what you do down here, but what I set up camp down here. I like string up twinkle lights, I order takeout food. I live down here sometimes, just dreaming about the day that I come up and how awesome it's going to be. But I stay down here a lot. And here's what we do. The arena's right there. You can see it. The light's there. And the fear is this. I'm scared. A lot of self-doubt, comparison, anxiety, uncertainty. And so what do most people do when they're walking into the arena and those things are going to greet them up top? What do? You armor up, right? This is where I would imagine the old days, that they got all their stuff on. But God, that stuff is heavy, and that stuff is suffocating. And the problem is, when you armor up against vulnerability, you shut yourself off. And I've said this to audiences before, but I have never said it to an audience where it is more true than today, this second. When you armor up in this hallway, you shut yourself off from everything that you do and that you love. Because vulnerability is certainly a part of fear and self-doubt and grief and uncertainty and shame, but it's also the birthplace of these. It's the birthplace of love, of belonging, of joy, trust, empathy, creativity, and innovation. Without vulnerability, you cannot create. So what I think you're asked to do as a creative on a daily basis is walk through this hall, get to the top of the stairs, and get naked. Of course. Get naked. Get really real. Put yourself out there and walk out there so people can see you and see what you've made and see what you're doing. So when we walk out, this is what we see. Lots of seats, lots of people. But we focus in and we focus on this, the critics. I used to think the best way to put your work out into the world is to make sure the critics are not in the arena. But you have no control over who's in the arena. And the best way I have found is to know that they're there and to know exactly what they're going to say to you, because each of you know. The 3 seats that will always be taken when you walk into the arena, when you share your work with someone, the 3 seats that will always be taken are shame, scarcity, and comparison. Shame, completely universal human emotion. We all have it. It's that gremlin that whispers, you're not enough. Or if you're feeling pretty confident, like this, I went through this like when Scott was talking, I went back and forth from like a ping pong table with gremlins, back from, oh my God, I'm not enough, to, I can do this, I can totally do, oh, who do you think you are? That's the other gremlin, that's how it works. Like, look at you, big for your britches. I clearly have Texas gremlins. I don't know that everyone says too big for their britches, but that's what my gremlins say. So shame always has a seat. The other seat that's always taken is scarcity. What am I doing what am I doing that's original? Everyone else is doing this. 150 people are doing it who are better trained than I am. What am I contributing? Does this really matter? The third seat, always comparison. How many of you ever struggle with comparison? Oh my God, comparison is a nightmare. You know, I made a pact not to talk to anyone in the green room because what I was afraid that I would end up doing is say, so what are you talking about? That's interesting because I'm going first. And so if it sounds super good, and I think I suck comparatively, I may say that. And then I'm catching a flight to Dallas. Comparison is always there. The 4th seat I left open for you. You gotta know who's in the 4th seat. Is it a teacher? Is it a parent? Is it a shitty ex-coworker? Am I the only one that's ever had one of those? The thing is, I don't care what people think. I don't worry about the critics in the arena. It sends a huge red flag up for me. We're hardwired for connection. When we stop caring what people think, we lose our capacity for connection. When we become defined by what people think, we lose our capacity to be vulnerable. Not caring what people think is its own kind of hustle. Trust me. So rather than locking these folks out from the arena, what I'm going to invite you to do, this way maybe, is reserve seats for them, which doesn't seem like a good thing to do. But I have 13,000 pieces of data, and I've done this work for 12 years. And what I have found and what I have learned from these folks and then tried to apply it in my own life that has changed my life is to reserve a seat, to take the critics to lunch, and to simply say when I'm trying to do something new and hard and original, and I'm trying to be creative, and I'm trying to innovate, to say, I see you, I hear you, but I'm going to show up and do this anyway. And I've got a seat for you, and you're welcome to come, but I'm not interested in your feedback. The other piece that's tough is, to me, if you're going to spend your life in the arena, if you're going to spend your life showing up, really showing up, there's a couple things that you need. The first is a clarity of values. You have to, I know, when I came out here, I knew I could screw this completely up. I could get booed off stage, bad things could happen, but I don't have a choice because if courage is my value, I have to do this. Whether it's successful or not is irrelevant. So a real clarity of values is important. The other thing is you got to have at least one person in your life who's willing to pick you up and dust you off and look at you when you fail, which hopefully you will, because if you're not failing, you're really not showing up. But who is willing to look at you when you fail and say, man, that sucked. Yeah, it was totally as bad as you thought. But you were brave. And let's get you cleaned up, and because you're going to go back in. And this is someone who loves you not despite your imperfections and vulnerabilities, but because of them. And they should have great seats in the arena. I forgot for 5, 10, for a decade, I forgot to invite these people into my arena. Because, it's the old, I always want to say Karl Marx, but it's Groucho Marx difference. I'm a social worker. We read a lot more Karl than Groucho. I didn't want to belong to a club that would let me in. I forgot to invite people because I thought, if you're my fan, if you're here supporting me, how important could you be? I'm trying to win over the people who hate me. You simply love me. You simply hold my hair back when I'm puking. You pay bills with me and raise kids with me. How important could you be? I'm looking for the stranger in the mall. That's who I'm trying to win over. Yes or no? Okay. The last part is, so I guess the real specific how-tos are this. The world keeps going, whether you know it or not. The critics are in the arena, whether you identify them and think about the messages that keep us small. They're there, whether you do that or not. What I have found in my life and what I've found in my research, which fueled what I did in my life, is that the people who have the most courage, who are willing to show up and be the most vulnerable, are the ones who are very clear about who the critics are. The ones who reserve seats for them and say, I hear you, I get it, I know where the messaging is coming from, I'm not buying it anymore. So to get very clear, the last thing, which I think is the hardest, is this. One of these seats needs to be reserved for you. One of these seats needs to be reserved for me. When we look up and we're putting an idea, our piece of art, our design forward, who do you think the biggest critic in the arena normally is? Yourself. And so, definitely me. Like, I have never watched either of those TED Talks. Because it's not in service of the work for me. And I try to do things that are only in service of my work, because what would it serve for me to watch it? I would sit there and go, oh my God, suck in your stomach. Oh my God, that's not what you were going to say. You know, we're so self-critical. And one of the things that I think happens, and I think this happens a lot, it happens in different professions, but I think I see it a lot with creatives, is there is an ideal of what you're supposed to be. And what a lot of us end up doing is we orphan the parts of ourselves that don't fit what that ideal is supposed to be. And what it leaves, when we orphan all those parts of us, is it just leaves the critic. And so reserved in this seat is this. Where we came from, how we started, our families, that's me, the oldest, of course. The lost years, the years where I was so lost and confused and hurt and disillusioned that I thought the only path to freedom was a flock of seagulls haircut. The higher the hair, the closer to God, we say in Texas. The people who love us, the moments that make us who we are. And in that share should be this person. The person who believes in what we're doing and why we're doing it. And the person who says, yeah, it's so scary to show up. It feels dangerous to be seen. It's terrifying. But it is not as scary, dangerous, or terrifying as getting to the end of our lives and thinking, what if I would have shown up? What would have been different? So here's to Sweaty Creatives. Thank y'all for having me. I am interested in some messy topics, but I want to be able to make them not messy. I want to understand them. I want to hack into these things that I know are important and lay the code out for everyone to see. So where I started was with connection. Connection is why we're here. It's what gives purpose and meaning to our lives. This is what it's all about. It doesn't matter whether you talk to people who work in social justice and mental health and abuse and neglect. What we know is that connection, the ability to feel connected, is neurobiologically, that's how we're wired. It's why we're here. So I thought, you know what? I'm going to start with connection. Well, you know that situation where you get an evaluation from your boss and she tells you 37 things that you do really awesome and one thing that you can't, an opportunity for growth. And all you can think about is that opportunity for growth, right? Well, apparently this is the way my work went as well, because when you ask people about love, they tell you about heartbreak. When you ask people about belonging, they'll tell you their most excruciating experiences of being excluded. And when you ask people about connection, the stories they told me were about disconnection. So very quickly, really about 6 weeks into this research, I ran into this unnamed thing that absolutely unraveled connection in a way that I didn't understand or had never seen. And so I pulled back out of the research and thought, I need to figure out what this is. And it turned out to be shame. And shame is really easily understood as the fear of disconnection. Is there something about me that if other people know it or see it, that I won't be worthy of connection? The things I can tell you about it, it's universal. We all have it. The only people who don't experience shame have no capacity for human empathy or connection. No one wants to talk about it, and the less you talk about it, the more you have it. What underpinned this shame, this I'm not good enough, which we all know that feeling. I'm not blank enough. I'm not thin enough, rich enough, beautiful enough, smart enough, promoted enough. The thing that underpinned this was excruciating vulnerability. This idea of, in order for connection to happen, we have to allow ourselves to be seen, really seen. And you know how I feel about vulnerability. I hate vulnerability. And so I thought, this is my chance to beat it back with my measuring stick. I'm going in. I'm going to figure this stuff out. I'm going to spend a year. I'm going to totally deconstruct shame. I'm going to understand how vulnerability works, and I'm going to outsmart it. So I was ready, and I was really excited. As you know, it's not going to turn out well. You know this. So I could tell you a lot about shame, but I'd have to borrow everyone else's time. But here's what I can tell you that it boils down to. And this may be one of the most important things that I've ever learned in the decade of doing this research. My 1 year has turned into 6 years, thousands of stories, hundreds of long interviews, focus groups. At one point, people were sending me journal pages and sending me their stories, thousands of pieces of data, in 6 years. And I kind of got a handle on it. I kind of understood this is what shame is, this is how it works. I wrote a book, I published a theory, but something was not okay. And what it was is that if I roughly took the people I interviewed and divided them into people who really have a sense of worthiness, that's what this comes down to, a sense of worthiness. They have a strong sense of love and belonging. And folks who struggle for it, and folks who are always wondering if they're good enough. There was only one variable that separated the people who have a strong sense of love and belonging and the people who really struggle for it, and that was the people who have a strong sense of love and belonging believe they're worthy of love and belonging. That's it. They believe they're worthy. And to me, the hard part of the one thing that keeps us out of connection is our fear that we're not worthy of connection, was something that personally and professionally I felt like I needed to understand better. So what I did is I took all of the interviews where I saw worthiness, where I saw people living that way, and just looked at those. What do these people have in common? And I have a slight office supply addiction, but it's another talk. So I had a manila notebook, a manila folder, and I had a Sharpie, and I was like, what am I going to call this research? And the first words that came to my mind were wholehearted. These are kind of wholehearted people living from this deep sense of worthiness. So I wrote at the top of the manila folder, and I started looking at the data. In fact, I did it first in this in a 4-day, very intensive data analysis where I went back, pulled these interviews, pulled the stories, pulled the incidents. What's the theme? What's the pattern? My husband left town with the kids because I always go into this kind of Jackson Pollock crazy thing where I'm just like writing and going and kind of just in my researcher mode. And so here's what I found. What they had in common was a sense of courage. And I want to separate courage and bravery for you for a minute. Courage, the original definition of courage, when it first came into the English language, it's from the Latin word cur, meaning heart. And the original definition was to tell the story of who you are with your whole heart. And so these folks had, very simply, the courage to be imperfect. They had the compassion to be kind to themselves first and then to others, because as it turns out, we can't practice compassion with other people if we can't treat ourselves kindly. And the last was they had connection, and this was the hard part, as a result of authenticity. They were willing to let go of who they thought they should be in order to be who they were, which is, you have to absolutely do that for connection. The other thing that they had in common was this. They fully embraced vulnerability. They believed that what made them vulnerable made them beautiful. They didn't talk about vulnerability being comfortable, nor did they really talk about it being excruciating, as I had heard earlier in the shame interviewing. They just talked about it being necessary. They talked about the willingness to say, I love you first. The willingness to do something where there are no guarantees. The willingness to breathe through waiting for the doctor to call after your mammogram. The willing to invest in a relationship that may or may not work out. They thought this was fundamental. I personally thought it was betrayal. I could not believe I had pledged allegiance to research, where our job, the definition of research is to control and predict, to study phenomenon for the explicit reason to control and predict. And now my mission to control and predict had turned up the answer that the way to live is with vulnerability and to stop controlling and predicting. This led to a little breakdown, which actually looked more like this. And it did. It led to I call it a breakdown, my therapist calls it a spiritual awakening. Spiritual awakening sounds better than breakdown, but I assure you it was a breakdown. And I had to put my data away and go find a therapist. Let me tell you something. You know who you are when you call your friends and say, I think I need to see somebody. Do you have any recommendations? Because about 5 of my friends were like, woo, I wouldn't want to be your therapist. And I was like, what does that mean? And they're like, I'm just saying, don't bring your measuring stick. I was like, okay. So I found a therapist. My first meeting with her, Diana, I brought in my list of the way the wholehearted live. And I sat down, and she said, how are you? And I said, I'm great, I'm okay. And she said, what's going on? And I said, and this is a therapist who sees therapists, because we have to go to those because their BS meters are good. And so I said, here's the thing. I'm struggling. And she said, what's the struggle? And I said, well, I have a vulnerability issue, and I know that vulnerability is kind of the core of shame and fear and our struggle for worthiness, but it appears that it's also the birthplace of joy, of creativity, of belonging, of love, and I think I have a problem, and I need some help. And I said, but here's the thing, no family stuff, no childhood shit, I just need some strategies. Thank you. So she goes like this. And then I said, it's bad, right? And she said, it's neither good nor bad. It just is what it is. And I said, oh my God, this is gonna suck. And it did, and it didn't. And it took about a year. And you know how there are people that, like, when they realize that vulnerability and tenderness are important, that they kind of surrender and walk into it? A, that's not me. And B, I don't even hang out with people like that. For me, it was a year-long street fight. It was a slugfest. Vulnerability pushed, I pushed back. I lost the fight, but probably won my life back. And so then I went back into the research and spent the next couple of years really trying to understand what they, the wholehearted, what the choices they were making, and what are we doing with vulnerability? Why do we struggle with it so much? Am I alone in struggling with vulnerability? No. So this is what I learned. We numb vulnerability. The problem is, and I learned this from the research, that you cannot selectively numb emotion. You can't say, here's the bad stuff. Here's vulnerability, here's grief, here's shame, here's fear, here's disappointment. I don't want to feel these. I'm going to have a couple of beers and a banana nut muffin. I don't want to feel these. And I know that's knowing laughing. I know that's, God. You can't numb those hard feelings without numbing the other affects or emotions. You cannot selectively numb. So when we numb those, we numb joy. We numb gratitude. We numb happiness. And then we are miserable and we are looking for purpose and meaning. And then we feel vulnerable. So then we have a couple of beers and a banana nut muffin. And it becomes this dangerous cycle. One of the things that I think that we need to think about is why and how we numb. And it doesn't just have to be addiction. The other thing we do is we make everything that's uncertain certain. Religion has gone from a belief in faith and mystery to certainty. I'm right, you're wrong, shut up. That's it. Just certain. The more afraid we are, the more vulnerable we are, the more afraid we are. There's no discourse anymore. There's no conversation. There's just blame. You know how blame is described in the research? A way to discharge pain and discomfort. We perfect. If there's anyone who wants their life to look like this, it would be me. But it doesn't work, because what we do is we take fat from our butts and put it in our cheeks. Which just, I hope in 100 years people will look back and go, wow. You know. And we perfect, most dangerously, our children. Let me tell you what we think about children. They're hardwired for struggle when they get here. When you hold those perfect little babies in your hand, our job is not to say, look at her, she's perfect. My job is just to keep her perfect, make sure she makes the tennis team by 5th grade and Yale by 7th grade. That's not our job. Our job is to look and say, you know what? You're imperfect and you're wired for struggle, but you are worthy of love and belonging. That's our job. Show me a generation of kids raised like that and we'll end the problems I think that we see today. We pretend that what we do doesn't have an effect on people. We do that in our personal lives. We do that corporate, whether it's a bailout, an oil spill, a recall. We pretend like what we're doing doesn't have a huge impact on other people. I would say to companies, this is not our first rodeo, people. We just need you to be authentic and real and say, we're sorry, we'll fix it. But there's another way, and I'll leave you with this. This is what I have found. To let ourselves be seen, deeply seen, vulnerably seen. To love with our whole hearts, even though there's no guarantee. And that's really hard, and I can tell you as a parent, that's excruciatingly difficult. To practice gratitude and joy in those moments of kind of terror when we're wondering, can I love you this much? Can I believe in this passionately? Can I be this fierce about this? Just to be able to stop and instead of catastrophizing what might happen, to say, I'm just so grateful. Because to feel this vulnerable means I'm alive. And the last, which I think is probably the most important, is to believe that we're enough. Because when we work from a place, I believe, that says, I'm enough, then we stop screaming and start listening. We're kinder and gentler to the people around us, and we're kinder and gentler to ourselves. I told these 500 people that I had a breakdown. I had a slide that said breakdown. At what point did I think that was a good idea? And I said, this can't happen. YouTube, they're putting this thing on YouTube, and we're going to be talking about 600, 700 people. And she said, well, I think, it's too late. And I said, let me ask you something. And she said, yeah. And I said, do you remember when we were in college and really wild and kind of dumb? She said, yeah. And I said, remember when we leave a really bad message on our ex-boyfriend's answering machine? Then we'd have to break into his dorm room and then erase the tape. And she goes, no. So, of course, the only thing I could think of to say at that point was, yeah, me neither. Yeah, me neither. And I'm thinking to myself, Brene, what are you doing? What are you doing? Why did you bring this up? Have you lost your mind? Your sisters would be perfect for this. So I looked back up and she said, are you really going to try to break in and steal the video before they put it on YouTube? And I said, I'm just thinking about it a little bit. She said, you're like the worst vulnerability role model ever. And then I looked at her and I said something that at the time felt a little dramatic, but ended up being more prophetic than dramatic. I said, if 500 turns into 1,000 or 2,000, my life is over. I had no contingency plan for 4 million. And my life did end when that happened. And maybe the hardest part about my life ending is that I learned something hard about myself, and that was that as much as I would be frustrated about not being able to get my work out to the world, there was a part of me that was working very hard to engineer staying small, staying right under the radar. But I want to talk about what I've learned. There's two things that I've learned in the last year. The first is vulnerability is not weakness. And that myth is profoundly dangerous. Let me ask you honestly, and I'll give you this warning. I'm trained as a therapist, so I can outweight you uncomfortably. So if you could just raise your hand, that would be awesome. How many of you, honestly, when you're thinking about doing something vulnerable or saying something vulnerable, think, God, vulnerability is weakness, this is weakness? How many of you think of vulnerability and weakness synonymously? The majority of people. Now let me ask you this question. This past week at TED, how many of you, when you saw vulnerability up here, thought it was pure courage? Vulnerability is not weakness. I define vulnerability as emotional risk, exposure, uncertainty. It fuels our daily lives. And I've come to the belief, this is my 12th year doing this research, that vulnerability is our most accurate measurement of courage. To be vulnerable, to let ourselves be seen, to be honest. One of the weird things that's happened is after the TED explosion, I got a lot of offers to speak all over the country. Everyone from schools and parent meetings to Fortune 500 companies. And so many of the calls went like this. Hey, Dr. Brown, we loved your TED Talk. We'd like you to come in and speak. We'd appreciate it if you wouldn't mention vulnerability or shame. What would you like for me to talk about? There's 3 big answers. This is mostly, to be honest with you, from the business sector. Innovation, creativity, and change. So let me go on the record and say, vulnerability is the birthplace of innovation, creativity, and change. To create is to make something that has never existed before. There's nothing more vulnerable than that. Adaptability to change is all about vulnerability. The second thing, in addition to really finally understanding the relationship between vulnerability and courage, the second thing I learned is this. we have to talk about shame. And I'm going to be really honest with you. When I became like a vulnerability researcher, and that became the focus because of the TED Talk, and I'm not kidding that. I'll give you an example. About 3 months ago, I was in a sporting goods store buying goggles and shin guards and all the things that parents buy at the sporting goods store. About from 100 feet away, this is what I hear: vulnerability TED, vulnerability TED. Yeah, I'm a 5th generation Texan. Our family motto is lock and load. I am not a natural vulnerability researcher. So I'm like, just keep walking, she's on my 6. And then I hear, vulnerability TED. I turn around, I go, hi. She's right here. And she said, you're the shame researcher who had the breakdown. At this point, parents are like pulling their children close to like, look away. And I'm so worn out at this point in my life. I look at her and I actually say, it was a frickin' spiritual awakening. And she looks back and does this. I know. And she said, we watched your TED Talk in my book club. Then we read your book and we renamed ourselves the Breakdown Babes. And she said, our tagline is, we're falling apart and it feels fantastic. So when I became Vulnerability TED, like an action figure, like Ninja Barbie, but I'm Vulnerability TED, I thought I'm gonna leave that shame stuff behind, because I spent 6 years studying shame before I really started writing and talking about vulnerability. And I thought, thank God, because shame is this horrible topic. No one wants to talk about it. It's the best way to shut people down on an airplane. What do? I study shame. Oh, and I see you, you know. But in surviving this last year, I was reminded of a cardinal rule, not a research rule, but a moral imperative from my upbringing. You gotta dance with the one who brung you. And I did not learn about vulnerability and courage and creativity and innovation from studying vulnerability. I learned about these things from studying shame. And so I want to walk you in to shame. Jungian analysts call shame the swampland of the soul. And we're going to walk in, and the purpose is not to walk in and, construct a home and live there. It is to put on some galoshes and walk through and find our way around. Here's why. You know why this place is amazing? Because very few people here are afraid to fail. And no one that gets on the stage so far that I've seen has not failed. I have failed miserably, many times. I don't think the world understands that because of shame. There's a great quote that saved me this past year by Theodore Roosevelt. A lot of people refer to it as the man in the arena quote. And it goes like this: it is not the critic who counts. It is not the man who sits and points out how the doer of deeds could have done things better and how he falls and stumbles. The credit goes to the man in the arena, whose face is marred with dust and blood and sweat. But when he's in the arena, at best, he wins, and at worst, he loses. But when he fails, when he loses, he does so daring greatly. That's what life is about daring greatly, about being in the arena. When you walk up to that arena and you put your hand on the door and you think, I'm going in and I'm going to try this, shame is the gremlin who says, you're not good enough. You never finished that MBA. Your wife left you. I know your dad really wasn't in Luxembourg, he was in Sing Sing. I know there's things that happened to you growing up. I know you don't think that you're pretty enough or smart enough or talented enough or powerful enough. I know your dad never paid attention even when you made CFO. Shame is that thing. And then if we can quiet it down and walk in and say, I'm going to do this, we look up and the critic that we see pointing and laughing, 99% of the time is who? Us. Shame drives two big tapes, never good enough, and if you can talk it out of that one, who do you think you are? The thing to understand about shame is it's not guilt. Shame is a focus on self, guilt is a focus on behavior. Shame is I am bad, guilt is I did something bad. Guilt, I'm sorry, I made a mistake. Shame, I'm sorry, I am a mistake. There is a huge difference between shame and guilt. And here's what you need to know. Shame is highly, highly correlated with addiction, depression, violence, aggression, bullying, suicide, eating disorders. Guilt, inversely correlated with those things. The ability to hold something we've done or failed to do up against who we want to be is incredibly adaptive. It's uncomfortable, but it's adaptive. Everyone sitting in here knows the warm wash of shame. We're pretty sure that the only people who don't experience shame are people who have no capacity for connection or empathy. Which means, yes, I have a little shame, no, I'm a sociopath. So I would opt for yes, you have a little shame. Shame feels the same for men and women, but it's organized by gender. For women, the best example I can give you is Anjali, the commercial. I can put the wash on the line, pack the lunches, hand out the kisses, and be work at 5 to 9. I can bring home the bacon, fry it up in the pan, and never let you forget you're a man. For women, shame is do it all, do it perfectly, and never let them see you sweat. I don't know how much perfume that commercial sold, but I guarantee you it moved a lot of antidepressants and anti-anxiety meds. Shame for women is this web of unattainable, conflicting, competing expectations about who we're supposed to be. And it's a straitjacket. For men, shame is not a bunch of competing, conflicting expectations. Shame is one. Do not be perceived as what? Weak. I did not interview men for the first 4 years of my study. And it wasn't until a man looked at me one day after a book signing and said, I love what you have to say about shame. I'm curious why you didn't mention men. And I said, I don't study men. And he said, that's convenient. And I said, why? And he said, because you say to reach out, tell our story, be vulnerable. But you see those books you just signed for my wife and my 3 daughters? I said, yeah. They'd rather me die on top of my white horse than watch me fall down. When we reach out and be vulnerable, we get the shit beat out of us. And don't tell me it's from the guys and the coaches and the dads. Because the women in my life are harder on me than anyone else. So I started interviewing men and asking questions. And what I learned is this. You show me a woman who can actually sit with a man in real vulnerability and fear, I'll show you a woman who's done incredible work. You show me a man who can sit with a woman who's just had it. She can't do it all anymore. And his first response is not, I unloaded the dishwasher. But he really listens, because that's all we need. I'll show you a guy who's done a lot of work. Shame is an epidemic in our culture. And to get out from underneath it, to find our way back to each other, we have to understand how it affects us and how it affects the way we're parenting, the way we're working, the way we're looking at each other. Very quickly, some research by Mahalik at Boston College. He asked, what do women need to do to conform to female norms? The top answers in this country: nice, thin, modest, and use all available resources for appearance. When he asked about men, what do men in this country need to do to conform with male norms? The answers were always show emotional control, work is first, pursue status, and violence. If we're going to find our way back to each other, we have to understand and know empathy, because empathy is the antidote to shame. If you put shame in a petri dish, it needs 3 things to grow exponentially: secrecy, silence, and judgment. If you put the same amount of shame in a petri dish and douse it with empathy, it can't survive. The 2 most powerful words when we're in struggle: me too. And so I'll leave you with this thought. If we're going to find our way back to each other. Vulnerability is going to be that path. And I know it's seductive to stand outside the arena because I think I did it my whole life and think to myself, I'm going to go in there and kick some ass when I'm bulletproof and when I'm perfect. And that is seductive. But the truth is, that never happens. And even if you got as perfect as you could and as bulletproof as you could possibly muster, when you got in there, that's not what we want to see. We want you to go in. We want to be with you and across from you. And we just want for ourselves and for the people we care about and the people we work with to dare greatly. So thank y'all very much. I really appreciate it.
Well, I see the progression of like the gifts of imperfection is be you. Daring greatly is be all in. And rising strong is fall, learn, get up, and do it again. And so it's the most personal book because as I was writing it, really the heart of this book is about these really dangerous stories we make up when we're in the midst of struggle, when we're in a fall. We are neurobiologically hardwired to make sense of that fall, to make sense of our hurt as fast as we can. And if we can come up with a story that makes sense of it, our brain chemically rewards us for that story, whether it's accurate or not. And so for me, what became very important is to write a book to help people understand when you fall, the stories you make up about your fall need to be really tested. And so as I was writing it, what I realized was that my stories of failure and heartbreak were the ones that gave me the most access to understanding what was happening behind the scenes in the story. Because we all do it. We all do it. I mean, if you and I finish this interview and we walk down the hill and I say, thanks a lot, I really appreciate it, and you go like this, my brain takes that as anxiety or fear, and I immediately make up a story. I knew she never liked me. That Super Soul Sunday really sucked. I didn't do the right thing. It was terrible. And then all of a sudden, I'm working off a whole narrative. How I treat you the next time I see you is off that narrative. And then, it just keeps going and going. That's the rising strong problem. Yes. So if we use that example of just you and I together. And so there's three pieces, the reckoning, the rumble, and the revolution. The reckoning has two seemingly easy, but pretty difficult pieces. The first thing I have to do is when you look at me like that and I feel something in response to it, I have to acknowledge, a button's been pushed. I've been hooked on something emotionally is happening here. I'm responding. And then I have to be willing to get curious about what it is. So instead of immediately going to my crazy story, I have to go to, okay, I'm emotionally hooked around something. I don't know what just happened, but I'm feeling like stressed out about it, or it hurt my feelings or something, and I need to figure out more. I mean, and
the reckoning is actually the recognition of it.
Reckoning. Something emotional has happened. But the big piece of the reckoning, and this is the part that really shocked me, is I'm willing to get curious and look into it. Do you know how many people are not curious about emotion because that was just drilled out of us growing up?
One major takeaway that I really hope for Chris to understand is the last bit where Brene goes over the stories that we tell ourselves. And I really want him to put himself in the public shoes. And I believe Trisha from Web Sleuths was trying to do that with him, and anger clouds judgment. And as I said, I was just guilty of it myself. So, and I'm not talking about judging other people. I'm talking about your better judgment, using your best judgment. And so she was trying to explain to him that people are going to be butts sometimes, but also they're trying to help. And so the pieces of information that we're trying to gather are to form that entire puzzle. I call these crumbs because it seems like we don't barely have anything. And so I can see how that would be frustrating if they don't have anything either. But we make up these stories in our heads because we're trying to make things look and become logical. And it's a natural response that all of us humans have, and it goes back to survival. Another piece of advice that sometimes I struggle with is a quote from one of my old bosses. He used to tell us, "You have 2 ears and one mouth for a reason, people." And I loved it so much. I used to crack up. I actually put a little monkey with his hands over his mouth and that quote in my cubicle when I was working in real estate. And I just think it's great, especially for someone like me who has just always been someone who likes to talk and has the gift of gab, if that's what you want to call it, and just is a talker. In sales, you learn to build rapport with people, and so you learn to make small talk or conversations, and you learn to become very relatable. And so, but one major piece of getting through to someone is listening. Like I told you guys before, I am definitely far from perfect. I got together with my daughter's father when we were both 16 years old, and we got divorced when we were about 28 years old. So we were in high school for a few years, had our daughter. We got married after my daughter was born in a Catholic church and all of that jazz. I myself was not a child of divorce. My parents' marriage, of course, wasn't perfect, but they were married for 25 years. My mom passed away when she was 49 from metastatic lung cancer. So when I got divorced, I definitely didn't know how my daughter was feeling or how it was going to affect her. The only play-by-play book that I know for dealing with life is the Bible. And I know that there are great resources out there to help people when they are in need. You just have to reach out and you have to look for them. That's Mr. Beagle. My point is that you're not alone. And even if you feel that way, or there are wretched trolls trying to make you feel like you are alone, you're not. We can all work to do better, and we can all do our part. And one thing that I really love about Duchess and her channel is that she talks about the fact that it takes a village. And it certainly does take a village to come together, and that is really what we're all here for, is for human connection. You cannot expect, however, that when you put content out there that there won't be some feedback coming back at you. And I know that's why we do reach out and why we do send things out into this universe, into the YouTube verse, is because we're longing for that sense of belonging and connection. But when you put something out there, you have to be 100% ready for things to come back. And it's not always going to be what you want, but if you put positive out there, I believe positive will come back like a boomerang. Michael Jordan has a great quote out there. It says, "I've failed over and over and over again in my life, and that is why I succeed." And add to that, fail daring greatly. This is Lady Freedom. I hope you enjoyed my raw narrative today. We will be back next time with part 2 of Web Sleuths Live, and I will try to practice everything that I have preached today. Lady Justice is blind, but we are not. Lady Justice listens carefully, and so should we. Thank you all so much for listening and being with me today. I will talk to you all very soon. Let's all keep praying for Sebastian Rogers and his family.